"Sir, that boy lives in my house," the dirty street kid said, pointing at the missing poster. Millionaire Thomas Bradford laughed cruelly. "A rat like you owning a house? Impossible." But what the boy revealed next destroyed him forever. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Riverside Avenue as Thomas Bradford stepped out of his black Mercedes, straightening his silk tie with practiced precision. At 42 years old, he was everything success looked like. Tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, perfectly styled hair touched with just enough gray to suggest wisdom, and a watch that could feed a family for a year. He'd stopped his car on this particular street corner for one reason only: to post another missing person flyer. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled the stack of papers from his briefcase, though he'd never admit the trembling was from anything other than rage. The poster showed a boy's face, clean, well-fed, smiling. Missing. Daniel Bradford, age 11, last seen 3 months ago. $100,000 reward for information leading to his safe return. Thomas had posted hundreds of these across the city. Hundreds of copies of his son's face staring back at him from telephone poles, store windows, bus stops. Each one a reminder of his failure. Each one a punch to his carefully constructed image of perfection. He reached the metal pole and began taping the poster, his jaw clenched tight. The police had been useless. Private investigators had found nothing. His ex-wife blamed him, though she'd been the one who'd insisted on joint custody, who'd created the chaos that allowed Daniel to slip through the cracks during a custody exchange that had gone horribly wrong. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was small, timid, barely audible over the street traffic. Thomas didn't turn around. He'd learned to ignore the beggars and street children that plagued this part of the city. Acknowledging them only encouraged more requests for handouts. "Sir, please, I need to tell you something." Thomas sighed with exaggerated annoyance and turned around, ready to dismiss whoever was interrupting his grief with their petty problems. What he saw made his lip curl in automatic disgust. A boy stood before him, maybe 12 or 13 years old, though malnutrition made it hard to tell. His clothes were layers of mismatched torn fabric that might have once belonged to several different people. His face was smudged with dirt that looked like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. His hair was matted and tangled, and his feet were wrapped in what appeared to be duct-taped cardboard inside shoes that had more holes than leather. But it was the boy's eyes that struck Thomas, large, dark, and filled with an intensity that seemed wrong for a street kid. These weren't the glazed, empty eyes of a drug user, or the calculating eyes of a young con artist. These were eyes that had seen something important, something urgent. Still, Thomas's first instinct was revulsion mixed with suspicion. "If you're here to ask for money, you can save your breath," Thomas said coldly, turning back to his poster. "I don't give handouts to people who are too lazy to work." "I'm not asking for money," the boy said, his voice stronger now. "I'm trying to tell you about him." He pointed at the poster with a finger so dirty that Thomas instinctively took a step back. "That boy in the picture, Daniel Bradford." Thomas froze, his hand still pressed against the poster. He turned slowly, his heart suddenly pounding. "What did you just say?" "The boy in the poster," the kid repeated, pointing again. "I know where he is." For a moment, Thomas felt hope surge through his chest like electricity. Then reality crashed down, and the hope curdled into anger. This was a scam, obviously a scam. Some street rat had seen the reward amount and decided to try his luck with a fake tip. "Of course you do," Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. You'll tell me where my son is if I give you the reward money up front? Or maybe you want me to follow you to some abandoned building where your friends are waiting to rob me?" The boy's expression didn't change. He didn't look offended or defensive or guilty. He just looked sad, which somehow made Thomas even angrier. "I don't want your money," the boy said quietly. "I just thought you should know that Daniel is safe. He's been staying with me." The absurdity of the statement made Thomas actually laugh out loud, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the nearby buildings. "Staying with you? You?" He gestured at the boy's appearance with undisguised contempt. "You don't even have a home. You're a street urchin, a vagrant, a nobody. My son is staying in some mansion right now, probably held by kidnappers who are too smart to contact me yet. He's certainly not staying with a rat like you." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. Thomas was vaguely aware of people with their phones out, probably recording. but he was too angry to care. This kid had dared to waste his time, had dared to give him a split second of hope before snatching it away with an obvious lie. "But I do have a home," the boy said, still in that maddeningly calm voice. "It's not much, but it's mine. And Daniel has been living there for almost 3 months. He's safe. He has food and a place to sleep. He's okay." "Stop lying!" Thomas shouted, causing several people in the growing crowd to jump. "My son would never stay in whatever cardboard box you call home. He's being held somewhere, probably terrified, probably hurt, and you're standing here making up stories for attention." The boy reached into his pocket, and Thomas instinctively tensed, half expecting a weapon. But what emerged was just a photograph. Worn, creased, and dirty, but definitely a photograph. "He asked me to keep this," the boy said, holding it out. "He said it was the only picture he took with him when he ran away. He said you took it at some beach. He said it was the last time he remembered you being happy." Thomas's world tilted sideways. He snatched the photograph from the boy's hand, not caring that his expensive suit sleeve brushed against the kid's filthy jacket. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely focus on the image. It was them. Thomas and Daniel, 3 years ago, on a beach in Hawaii. The last real vacation they'd taken before the divorce, before everything fell apart. Daniel was 8 in the photo, grinning with an ice cream cone melting down his hand. Thomas had his arm around his son's shoulders, and he was actually smiling, really smiling, not the professional smile he gave clients or the fake smile he used in photographs. He remembered this moment, remembered Daniel laughing because a seagull had tried to steal his ice cream, remembered feeling for just a brief moment like everything in his life was exactly right. The photograph had been in Daniel's room, on his nightstand. Thomas had noticed it was gone after Daniel disappeared, had assumed the kidnappers took it, or that it had been lost in whatever struggle had occurred. But this street kid had it, was holding it, knew about it. "Where did you get this?" Thomas's voice came out as a whisper, all the anger suddenly drained away, replaced by something that felt like fear. "Where did you really get this?" "I told you," the boy said patiently. "Daniel gave it to me. He's been living in my house since he ran away. He told me about you, about your ex-wife, about why he left. He made me promise not to tell anyone where he was because he was afraid you'd come get him and everything would go back to how it was before." "Ran away?" Thomas repeated, the words not making sense. "Daniel didn't run away. He was taken, during a custody exchange. His mother and I were fighting about pickup times, and when we turned around he was gone. Someone took him." The boy's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity, which made Thomas's stomach twist with a new kind of dread. "Mr. Bradford," the boy said gently, "nobody took Daniel. He walked away while you and his mom were screaming at each other. He said you didn't even notice he was gone for almost 20 minutes. He said he'd been planning it for weeks, that he couldn't take the fighting anymore. He said he'd rather live on the streets than watch his parents destroy each other." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He looked around at the crowd of people watching, their phones still recording, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He was acutely aware of how this must look. A wealthy man in an expensive suit being confronted by a homeless child about his missing son. "You're lying," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Daniel would never run away. He had everything, a good home, good schools, everything a child could want, except parents who didn't hate each other, the boy said quietly. "That's what he told me. He said he had everything except the one thing that actually mattered." Thomas felt his legs suddenly weak. He reached out to steady himself against the telephone pole, his hand landing right on top of his son's missing poster. The boy in the photograph smiled up at him, frozen in a moment of happiness that now seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. "If what you're saying is true," Thomas said slowly, "if my son really has been staying with you, then why didn't you contact the police? Why didn't you tell someone? There's a $100,000 reward. You could have claimed it." "Because Daniel asked me not to," the boy said simply. "He said he'd run again if anyone tried to send him back. He said he'd disappear somewhere I couldn't find him, somewhere nobody could find him, and I believed him. He's smart, Mr. Bradford, really smart. If he wanted to disappear completely, he could." Thomas stared at this filthy street kid who claimed to have been harboring his son for 3 months. Nothing about this made sense. How could a homeless child provide better care than Thomas could with all his money and resources? How could Daniel possibly prefer living in poverty over the comfort of his own home? But the photograph was real. The details the boy knew were real. And something in those intense, honest eyes made Thomas believe that he was telling the truth. "Take me to him," Thomas said abruptly. "Right now. Take me to wherever you're keeping my son." The boy hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "He doesn't want to see you yet. He said he needs more time." "I don't care what he wants." Thomas's voice rose again, attracting renewed attention from the crowd. "He's 11 years old. He's my son. You can't just keep him hidden away like some kind of..." "Like some kind of what?" the boy interrupted, his calm finally cracking to show a flash of anger. "Like some kind of person who has feelings and opinions. Like someone who gets to make choices about his own life. That's exactly what you did that made him run away in the first place." The truth of it struck Thomas silent. He thought about the custody battle, the screaming matches with his ex-wife, the way they'd pulled Daniel back and forth between them like he was a trophy to be won, rather than a child to be loved. The way they'd scheduled every minute of his life between soccer practice and tutoring and music lessons, never once asking if those were things Daniel actually wanted to do. "I want to see my son," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "Please, I just want to know he's okay." The boy studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay, but not today. He needs to be prepared. He needs to know you're coming. If you just show up, he'll run, and I won't be able to stop him." "When?" Thomas demanded. "Tomorrow. Meet me here at the same time." "And Mr. Bradford?" The boy's expression became serious. "Come alone. No police, no security, no private investigators. If Daniel sees anyone else, he'll disappear. Do you understand?" Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to demand immediate access to his son, wanted to call the police right now and have them follow this kid. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the conviction in the boy's voice. Maybe it was the realization that Daniel had chosen to stay hidden for 3 months, which meant he was determined enough to stay hidden longer if necessary. "Fine," Thomas agreed reluctantly. "Tomorrow. Same time. Alone." The boy nodded and turned to walk away, blending almost immediately into the afternoon crowd despite his distinctive appearance. "Wait," Thomas called out. "What's your name? I don't even know your name." The boy looked back over his shoulder. "My name is Christopher Hayes. And Mr. Bradford? Maybe spend tonight thinking about why your son chose a stranger's house over his own. Because if you can't figure that out, bringing him home won't change anything." Then Christopher disappeared into the crowd, leaving Thomas standing alone on a street corner, clutching a photograph and a stack of missing person posters that suddenly seemed pointless. Around him, the crowd slowly dispersed, their phones full of videos that would probably be all over social media within hours. Thomas Bradford, millionaire real estate developer, confronted by a homeless child about his missing son. The humiliation should have bothered him. The public spectacle should have infuriated him. But all Thomas could feel was the crushing weight of a question he couldn't answer. Why would his son rather live in poverty with a stranger than in luxury with his own father? And somewhere deep down, beneath the shock and the confusion and the desperate relief that Daniel was apparently alive and safe, Thomas felt the first stirrings of something he'd been avoiding for 3 months. Guilt. Thomas Bradford didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse office staring at the worn photograph Christopher had returned. The edges were frayed from constant handling, carried in a pocket, looked at during moments when Daniel needed to remember something good. His phone buzzed constantly. 17 missed calls from his ex-wife, Margaret. She'd seen the videos. By midnight, the encounter with Christopher was trending. Millionaire confronted by homeless boy about missing son had been shared thousands of times. Thomas ignored the calls. What would he tell Margaret? That their son had been alive for 3 months, living with a street kid? That Daniel had chosen poverty over their custody battles? At 3 a.m, Thomas searched for information about Christopher Hayes. Child services reports, school records, anything. He found old records, but nothing recent. Christopher Hayes had attended elementary school until 2 years ago, and then simply vanished from the system. No foster care placement. No missing person reports filed. It was as if the boy had dissolved into thin air the moment he turned 11. which meant either Christopher Hayes wasn't his real name, or the child had slipped through every crack in the system. Thomas thought about Christopher's eyes, strangely intense eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Eyes holding knowledge and sadness and something else, resilience, or resignation to a life no child should live. But the photograph was real. Thomas had examined it under magnification, looking for forgery. It was authentic, the same photo that had disappeared from Daniel's nightstand 3 months ago. As dawn broke, Thomas finally stood and changed clothes. Not his aggressive power suits, but something casual. Expensive jeans, simple shirt, leather jacket. He wanted to look approachable, not like the cold businessman Daniel had run from. But when he looked in the mirror, Thomas barely recognized himself. When had the lines around his eyes become so deep? When had gray threaded through his temples so prominently? He looked older than 42. Tired. He looked like a man who'd lost something important. The morning hours crawled agonizingly. Thomas tried to work, but the words blurred meaninglessly. His mind kept returning to that street corner, to Christopher's calm voice delivering impossible truths. A homeless child had pitied him. A kid living in unimaginable conditions had looked at millionaire Thomas Bradford and felt sorry for him. The humiliation should have enraged him. Instead, it just made him feel hollow. At 2 o'clock, Thomas drove to Riverside Avenue. He arrived 30 minutes early, not wanting to seem desperate, though he felt it with intensity that made his hands shake. He reached the telephone pole where he'd posted the flyer yesterday. Someone had torn it down. The space was empty now, just weathered metal and old staple marks. Thomas checked his watch. 2:30. Right on time. He waited. 2:45. Still no Christopher. 3 o'clock. Nothing. Thomas felt panic clawing at his chest. This had been a setup, or Daniel had changed his mind about seeing his father. At 3:15, just as Thomas was pulling out his phone, a small voice spoke behind him. "You came alone." "Good." Thomas spun around to find Christopher standing there. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another boy, and Thomas's breath caught violently. Daniel, his son, alive, real, standing right there. But he looked so different from the posters. Daniel's face was thinner, cheeks hollow from too many missed meals. His clothes were mismatched and worn like Christopher's. His hair was longer, unkempt, falling into eyes that looked haunted. But it was Daniel. "Daniel," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. Daniel didn't move. Didn't run for a hug. He just stood there, gripping Christopher's sleeve, body tensed to bolt. "Hi, Dad," Daniel said quietly, and the formal distance hurt worse than any accusation. Thomas took a step forward. Immediately Daniel stepped back, pulling Christopher with him. "Don't come closer." Thomas froze, arms hanging uselessly, wanting desperately to embrace his son, but afraid any movement would send him running. "You're okay," Thomas said. "You're alive. You're okay." "Yeah," Daniel said. "I'm okay. I've been looking everywhere. The police, private investigators, everyone. Your mother and I—" Thomas stopped, seeing Daniel's expression close at Margaret's mention. "We've been so worried." "I know," Daniel said without apology. No regret, just flat acknowledgement. "I saw the posters. I'm sorry you were worried, but I couldn't stay. You know I couldn't." "Why?" Thomas heard desperation in his voice. "Why would you run away? We gave you everything." "Except parents who didn't hate each other," Daniel interrupted. "Except a home that wasn't a war zone. Except a childhood that wasn't ammunition in your fight with Mom." Each word was a knife. "That's not—" Thomas started. "Yes, it is. Don't lie now, Dad. I'm not a little kid anymore. Every custody exchange was a battle. Every call ended shouting. Every birthday was ruined because you and Mom fought over who got more time instead of noticing I didn't want to be with either of you." Thomas felt tears burning but tried to blink them back. He would not cry. Had to be strong. Be the father Daniel needed. But hadn't that been the problem? Always appearing strong instead of being present? "You're right," Thomas said, the admission costing more than any business negotiation. "You're absolutely right. Your mother and I were so focused on winning that we forgot we were raising a child, not claiming a prize." Daniel's expression flickered with surprise. Christopher's hand tightened supportively on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Thomas continued, words coming easier like a dam breaking. "I'm so sorry, Daniel, for the fighting, for making you choose between us, for not seeing how we hurt you. I thought I was fighting for you, but I was just fighting with your mother. You paid the price. I don't want to go back, Daniel said, voice shaking, tough facade cracking. I'd rather stay here with Christopher. At least here, nobody's pretending. Here? Thomas looked at Christopher. Where have you been living? Christopher and Daniel exchanged glances. Finally, Christopher spoke. I have a place. Not much, but safe and dry. Daniel's been staying with me. I make sure he has food and somewhere to sleep. You're a child yourself, Thomas said gently. How are you taking care of another child? The same way I take care of myself, Christopher replied with quiet dignity. I'm resourceful. Daniel helps. We look out for each other. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. His son, his 11-year-old son, reduced to scavenging, sleeping somewhere unknown, depending on a street kid's resourcefulness. And Daniel claimed this was better. Show me, Thomas said suddenly. Show me where you've been living. Please. Christopher and Daniel looked at each other. Silent communication passing. Thomas waited, barely breathing. Okay, Daniel finally said. But Dad, you have to promise something. Anything. You can't try to make me leave. Can't call police or child services. You just come, see where I've been living, then let me choose what happens next. Every parental instinct screamed refusal. To grab his son now, carry him to the car, use money and power to fix this immediately. But he looked at Daniel's face, the determination, the readiness to run, and knew forcing the issue would drive his son further away. I promise, Thomas said. No police, no force. You choose. Daniel studied him for signs of deception. Finally, he nodded. Okay, follow us, but not too close. If you make Christopher nervous, we're gone. They walked through city streets, Thomas staying 20 feet behind, as the boys navigated through crowds and intersections with easy familiarity. Thomas tried imagining his son learning this geography of survival. Each mental image turned his stomach. They walked nearly 30 minutes, moving from prosperous downtown into progressively run-down neighborhoods. Abandoned buildings, empty lots with trash, streets where people eyed Thomas's expensive clothing with calculation. Finally, Christopher and Daniel stopped before a building that made Thomas's heart sink. An old factory, 3 stories of crumbling brick, shattered windows, chain-link fence with broken gate, graffiti everywhere. The smell of decay overwhelming. This is where you've been living? Thomas asked, unable to hide horror. Not in the factory, Christopher said, almost amused. In there. He pointed to a small building behind the factory, perhaps once a groundskeeper's cottage. Slightly better condition, most windows intact. Functional door. Christopher produced a key from his clothing layers and unlocked the door. Welcome, Christopher said simply, to my home. Thomas stepped inside and stopped, prepared criticisms dying unspoken. The interior was nothing like expected S. It was small, a tiny space with barely 2 rooms. Yes, furniture was salvaged from dumpsters. Yes, no proper heating, just a small space heater. But it was clean, meticulously clean. Wooden floor swept and scrubbed until shining. Mismatched furniture carefully arranged to maximize space. Curtains sewn from old sheets provided privacy. Books lined a makeshift shelf. Library books, properly checked out. One corner had sleeping area with 2 thin mattresses, neatly folded blankets and pillows. Between them, a milk crate table holding a jar lamp with battery light. Walls decorated with drawings, Daniel's work. Thomas recognized his son's artistic style. Landscapes, portraits, abstract designs, pinned with thumbtacks or carefully taped. This wasn't a squat. This was a home. A real home created with determination and care and whatever resources 2 children could scrape together. Christopher found this place years ago, Daniel explained, watching his father. Fixed it up himself. The lock, windows, everything. He made it safe. Thomas looked at Christopher with new eyes. Not just a street kid, a survivor who'd built something from nothing, who'd created stability in chaos, who'd become more parent to Daniel in 3 months than Thomas had been in years. How old are you? Thomas asked. 13, Christopher replied. And you've been living here alone? Not alone, not anymore. Christopher's hand found Daniel's shoulder. Daniel's been here. He's family now. The word family hit Thomas like a freight train. His son had found family. Not in the mansion, not in private schools, but in a salvaged cottage with a street kid who understood what Daniel needed. "What happened to your parents?" Thomas heard himself ask. Christopher's expression closed immediately. "They're gone. That's all that matters." Subject not open for discussion. Thomas looked around again. "How do you eat?" "Community kitchen 3 blocks away," Christopher explained. "Meals, no questions. I also work sometimes. Odd jobs, carrying groceries, helping with furniture. Store owners let me sweep for a few dollars. It's enough." "And school?" Thomas looked at Daniel. "Christopher's been teaching me," Daniel said defensively. "He's really smart, Dad. Math every morning, reading every afternoon. He got library cards so we could check out textbooks." Thomas sat heavily on a salvaged chair, world tilting sideways. His son living in poverty, depending on charity meals, claiming to be happier than in the mansion. "Why?" Thomas asked. "Why is this better than home?" "Dad, you still don't get it," Daniel interrupted. "I didn't need those things. I needed parents who talked without screaming. I needed a home where I felt safe. I needed to matter more than your custody battle. You did matter. No, I was a trophy you and Mom fought over. Neither of you asked what I wanted." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because Daniel was right. "Christopher doesn't have much," Daniel continued, "but he listens. He asks what I think. He doesn't try to buy my love. He's just there. That's what I needed." Christopher sat beside Daniel, and Thomas watched his son lean into the older boy's shoulder, seeking comfort. The gesture so natural, so trusting. "I don't know how to fix this," Thomas admitted, voice breaking. "I thought providing financially was enough. I was wrong." Daniel looked at him, something softening in his eyes. "You can't fix it overnight," Daniel said. "But you could start by talking to Mom. Really talking, not fighting. You could ask what I want. You could be my dad instead of trying to win." "Your mother hates me," Thomas said helplessly. "She doesn't hate you," Christopher interjected. "She hates fighting with you. People who hate each other don't cry after custody exchanges. I've seen your ex-wife in her car, crying. That's not hate, that's exhaustion." Thomas stared at Christopher. "You've been watching us." "Watching out for Daniel," Christopher corrected. "Your ex-wife is tired of fighting. You're tired. Daniel's tired of being fought over. So maybe stop fighting and start working together." "I don't know how to start that conversation." "Start by telling her Daniel's okay," Christopher suggested. "Start by asking if she's as tired as you are." Thomas looked at this 13-year-old who'd become wiser than men 3 times his age. "How do you know all this?" "When you're invisible, you learn to see things they don't." "And what does Daniel really need?" "Parents who are a team instead of enemies," Christopher said. "Stability. To know loving one of you doesn't mean betraying the other." Every word was truth. Every word hurt. "Okay," Thomas said quietly. "I'll talk to your mother. Really talk. We'll figure this out together, all of us, including you," he added, looking at Christopher. "You're part of this family now, too." Christopher's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with tears. He blinked away. "I'm not family. You kept my son safe when I couldn't," Thomas interrupted. "That makes you family." Silence heavy with emotion. Daniel wiped his eyes. Christopher stared at the floor. Thomas felt his own tears spill. "So, what happens now?" Daniel asked. "Now I keep my promise. I don't force you home, but I ask you to give me a chance to show things can be different. Let me talk to your mother. If we fail, you make whatever choice you need." Daniel looked at Christopher, who nodded. "Okay," Daniel said, "but I'm staying here for now. When you and Mom figure things out, then we can talk about me coming home. Not the reunion Thomas dreamed of, but a beginning." "Deal," Thomas agreed. "But let me at least help. Make sure you both have proper food, warm clothes." "No money," Christopher said firmly. "Not money, just help, resources. You don't have to be alone." Christopher looked uncertain but finally nodded. "Food would be good. Real food. And warmer blankets. Winter's coming." "Done," Thomas said. "Christopher, thank you. For everything." "I didn't do it for thanks," Christopher said quietly. "I did it because Daniel needed someone. Nobody should have to be alone." The statement revealed more about Christopher's pain than any explanation could. As Thomas stood to leave, promising to return with supplies, He felt fundamentally changed. He'd walked in expecting to rescue his son. Instead, he'd been taught the most important lesson by a 13-year-old, that love wasn't about providing things or winning battles. It was about showing up, listening, being there. He'd failed that test, but maybe he was being given a chance to retake it. As he walked toward his car, Thomas pulled out his phone and stared at Margaret's number. The hardest conversation of his life was waiting. But for Daniel, he would have it. And this time, he would actually listen. Thomas sat in his car for 20 minutes before he found the courage to press call. Margaret's number glowed on his phone screen like an accusation. How many times had he called this number to argue about pickup times, to fight about holidays, to weaponize their son in battles neither of them could win? His finger hovered over the screen. Then he thought about Daniel's hollow cheeks, about Christopher's wise eyes, about the way his son had flinched away from his touch. He pressed call. Margaret answered on the first ring. Thomas. Her voice was sharp, defensive, already preparing for battle. I've seen the videos. Everyone's seen them. So it's true? Some homeless kid knows where Daniel is? He's not just some homeless kid, Thomas said quietly. His name is Christopher. He's 13 years old. And yes, he knows where Daniel is, because Daniel has been living with him for 3 months. Silence. Thomas could hear Margaret's breathing, quick and shallow, like she was trying not to cry or scream or both. Living with him, Margaret repeated slowly. Our son has been living on the streets with a stranger while we've been... Her voice broke. While we've been tearing each other apart, looking for him. Daniel wasn't kidnapped, Margaret. He ran away. During that custody exchange when we were fighting. He walked away while we were screaming at each other, and he didn't look back. That's not... Margaret started, but Thomas interrupted. It is. I've seen him. I talked to him. And Margaret, he told me why he left. He said he couldn't take the fighting anymore. He said he'd rather live in poverty than watch us destroy each other. Thomas heard something crash on Margaret's end. A glass, maybe, or a plate. Then silence. Then the sound of sobbing so raw and painful that Thomas felt his own eyes burning. Where are you? Margaret asked through tears. Home. But Margaret, I need to see you. We need to talk. Really talk, not fight. Can you come here? Please? Another long silence. Then, I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up before Thomas could respond. Thomas drove home in a daze, his mind replaying every moment with Daniel. The way his son had looked at him with such wariness. The way Daniel had leaned into Christopher for comfort instead of his own father. The small cottage that had more love in its 400 square feet than Thomas's penthouse had in its thousands. He reached his building and took the elevator to the 32nd floor, each second feeling like an hour. His penthouse was exactly as he'd left it that morning. Immaculate, expensive, empty. Modern furniture arranged perfectly. Abstract art on the walls chosen by an interior designer. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city. Daniel had lived here. Had a bedroom bigger than Christopher's entire home. Had his own bathroom, his own television, his own everything. And he'd hated it. Thomas walked to the window and stared out at the city, seeing it differently now. Somewhere out there was the factory, the cottage, the place his son had chosen over this luxury. The doorbell rang. Thomas opened it to find Margaret standing in the hallway, and for a moment he barely recognized her. His ex-wife looked like she'd aged 5 years in 3 months. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, no makeup, wearing sweatpants and an old sweater he remembered from their marriage. She'd always been so put together, so perfectly styled. Now she just looked exhausted. Where is he? Margaret demanded, pushing past Thomas into the penthouse. Where's Daniel? Is he here? No, he's still with Christopher. He didn't want to come home yet. Margaret spun to face him, her expression a mixture of rage and devastation. What do you mean he didn't want to come home? He's 11 years old. He doesn't get to make that decision. Yes, he does, Thomas said firmly. Margaret, sit down. Please, we need to talk about this. I don't want to sit down. I want my son. So do I. Thomas's voice rose to match hers. Then he stopped, remembering Daniel's words. Every conversation became a fight. Every interaction turned into warfare. He took a deep breath and lowered his voice deliberately. I'm sorry. You're right to be upset. But Margaret, yelling isn't going to bring him home. It's what drove him away in the first place. Margaret stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. What? Sit down, Thomas said gently. Please, I need to tell you everything, and you need to hear it. Then we can figure out what to do together. Not fighting. Together. Something in his tone must have penetrated her anger, because Margaret slowly sank onto the sofa. Thomas sat across from her, not too close, giving her space. Daniel is safe, Thomas began. He's been living in a small cottage behind an abandoned factory with Christopher. It's not much. No running water, no heating except a space heater, furniture salvaged from trash. But Margaret, it's clean. It's organized. Christopher has created a real home there. A 13-year-old created a home, Margaret said flatly. Better than we did. Yes, Thomas admitted. Because Christopher gave Daniel something we didn't. He listened. He asked what Daniel wanted. He was present without all the fighting and chaos. Margaret's face crumpled. I tried. Thomas, I tried so hard to give him a good life. So did I. But we were so busy fighting with each other that we forgot to actually raise him. Every custody exchange became a battle. Every phone call ended in accusations. We used our son as a weapon against each other, and we broke him. Don't put this all on me, Margaret said sharply. You were the one who wouldn't compromise on anything. You were the one who hired expensive lawyers to fight for more custody time. You're right, Thomas said, and watched Margaret's eyes widen in shock. I did do those things, and you did similar things. We both failed him, Margaret. Equally. Neither of us is more to blame than the other. We were both so focused on winning that we forgot what we were fighting for. Margaret wiped her eyes. When did you become so reasonable? The Thomas I divorced would have blamed everything on me and demanded I admit fault. I met a 13-year-old street kid who taught me more about being a parent in one day than I learned in 11 years of actually being one, Thomas said. Christopher showed me what Daniel needed, what we should have been giving him all along. Tell me about him, Margaret said quietly. About Christopher. Who is he? Thomas described the encounter on Riverside Avenue. Christopher's calm dignity. The photograph that had broken through his disbelief. He described following the boys through deteriorating neighborhoods, expecting the worst, and finding something unexpected. He described the cottage, the books, the drawings on the walls. He described Daniel's face when he'd seen his father, the fear, the wariness, the desperate grip on Christopher's sleeve. He was afraid of me, Thomas whispered. Our son was afraid of his own father. Not because I hit him or abused him, but because I represented a life he couldn't survive anymore. Margaret was crying openly now. What did he say? When you talked to him? Thomas repeated Daniel's words as accurately as he could remember. The accusations about being a trophy in their battle. The preference for poverty over their fighting. The simple statement that Christopher listened while his parents never did. He said he'll give us a chance, Thomas finished. But only if we prove we can work together. That we can stop fighting and actually be his parents instead of his enemies. I don't know if I can do that, Margaret said honestly. Thomas, when I look at you, all I see is 3 years of court battles and lawyer fees and arguments over every single decision. I know. I feel the same way about you. But Margaret, we have to try. Because if we don't, we lose him forever. He'll disappear into the city with Christopher. And this time we won't find him. What does he want from us? He wants parents who can be in the same room without destroying each other. He wants to know that loving one of us doesn't mean betraying the other. He wants to be 11 years old instead of a battlefield. Margaret stood and walked to the window, staring out at the same view Thomas had been looking at earlier. Christopher sounds remarkable. To take in a runaway child, to keep him safe, to teach him, all while surviving on his own. That takes extraordinary courage. He said something that struck me, Thomas said. He said nobody should have to be alone. I think he knows what that feels like. Something happened to him. Something that left him on the streets. And instead of becoming bitter or cruel, he became the person who makes sure others don't feel that loneliness. I want to meet him, Margaret said suddenly. I want to meet the boy who kept our son alive when we couldn't. Tomorrow, Thomas said. I'm bringing them supplies tomorrow. Food, blankets, warmer clothes for winter. Come with me. Not to force Daniel home, but to show him we can be on the same side. Margaret turned to face him. Can we? Can we really stop fighting after everything that's happened? I don't know, Thomas admitted. But I know we have to try. For Daniel. And maybe for ourselves too. Because, Margaret, I'm tired. Aren't you tired? So tired, Margaret whispered. I'm so tired of hating you. I'm so tired of the anger and the resentment and the constant battle. I just want my son back. Then we worked together. We put aside every grudge, every hurt, every argument. We show Daniel that we can change, that we're worth coming home to. And if we can't, Margaret asked, if we try and fail, then we keep trying. Because the alternative is losing him forever. And I can't accept that. Can you? Margaret shook her head. What do we do now? Now we sit down and make a plan. Not a custody plan or a legal strategy. A plan for how we're going to be better parents. How we're going to create a home Daniel actually wants to live in. They talked for hours. Really talked. For the first time since before the divorce. They discussed their mistakes, admitted their failures, shared their fears. Margaret confessed that she'd used Daniel as proof that she was the better parent. Thomas admitted he'd seen custody time as a competition to win. They both acknowledged that somewhere in the fighting, they'd forgotten to love their son without conditions, without using him as ammunition, without making him choose sides. As dawn broke over the city, Margaret finally stood to leave. Thank you, she said at the door. For calling me, for being honest, for not turning this into another fight. Thank you for listening, Thomas replied, for being willing to try. Tomorrow then, Margaret said. We go together? Together, Thomas confirmed, as Daniel's parents, not as enemies. After she left, Thomas sat in his empty penthouse and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Hope that maybe they could fix this. Hope that maybe Daniel would come home. Hope that maybe a 13-year-old street kid had taught them how to be the parents they should have been all along. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph Christopher had returned. Him and Daniel on that beach, both smiling, both happy. We'll get back there, Thomas whispered to the image. I promise, Daniel. We'll find our way back to that moment, when you felt safe and loved and happy. And this time, they'd make sure that moment lasted. The next morning, Thomas and Margaret drove to the factory together in Thomas's Mercedes. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. Just two people who'd hurt each other learning how to exist in the same space without weapons drawn. Margaret stared out the window as they passed through increasingly deteriorating neighborhoods. I never knew these areas existed, she said quietly. I've lived in this city my entire life, and I never saw this. Neither did I, Thomas admitted. We've been living in a bubble. They'd spent hours shopping that morning. Not the expensive designer stores Thomas usually frequented, but practical places. Warm blankets, thermal clothing, non-perishable food, batteries, flashlights. Margaret had insisted on buying books, art supplies, and a portable heater that actually worked. Christopher's 13, she'd said. He deserves to have things that aren't just survival. He deserves to have things that are just for him. Now they pulled up to the abandoned factory, and Thomas saw Margaret's face go pale as she took in the crumbling structure. Our son has been living here. Her voice was barely audible. Behind it, the cottage is actually better than it looks from the outside. They gathered the supplies and walked through the broken gate. Thomas knocked on the cottage door, suddenly nervous. What if Daniel had changed his mind? What if seeing both parents together triggered him? Christopher opened the door, and his eyes went immediately wary when he saw Margaret. It's okay, Thomas said quickly. This is Daniel's mother, Margaret. I told her everything. She wants to meet you. She wants to help. Christopher studied Margaret with those intense eyes that saw too much. Whatever he found must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly and stepped aside. Daniel, he called into the cottage. Your mom is here. Margaret gasped as Daniel appeared. Her hand flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks. Daniel. Oh, my baby. Daniel stood frozen, looking between his mother and father with an expression Thomas couldn't read. Fear? Hope? Both? Hi, Mom, Daniel said carefully. You're not fighting. We're not fighting, Margaret confirmed, her voice shaking. We're here together, as your parents, not as enemies. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move closer. Did Dad tell you why I left? He told me everything, Margaret said. And Daniel, he was right, about all of it. We failed you. We were so focused on hurting each other that we forgot the only person we were really hurting was you. I don't want apologies, Daniel said, and Thomas heard the steel underneath his son's voice. I've heard apologies before. They don't mean anything if nothing changes. You're right, Margaret agreed, which is why we're not offering empty apologies. We're offering something else, a promise to do better. And actions to prove it. She gestured to the bags they'd brought. We brought supplies, for both of you, because Christopher has been taking care of you when we couldn't, and that deserves recognition. Christopher looked uncomfortable. I told Mr. Bradford, I don't want— Not money, Margaret interrupted gently. Just things you need, things that will make winter easier. Please, let us help. Christopher glanced at Daniel, who nodded slightly. Okay, thank you. They spent the next hour unpacking supplies. Margaret arranged food in Christopher's makeshift pantry, asking questions about how they cooked, what they liked to eat, what they needed. She was genuinely interested, not condescending or pitying. Thomas set up the new heater, tested it, made sure it was safe. He noticed details he'd missed yesterday, how Christopher had reinforced the window frames, how he'd created a rainwater collection system, how every inch of space was utilized efficiently. You built all this yourself? Thomas asked. Christopher nodded. Took time. But I had time. How long have you been on your own? Christopher's expression closed slightly, but after a moment he answered, 2 years. Since I was 11. Margaret, who'd been listening while organizing blankets, froze. 11 years old? Christopher, what happened to your parents? The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel moved closer to Christopher, a show of support. Christopher looked at the floor, his hands clenched. You don't have to tell us, Thomas said gently. We're not asking to invade your privacy. We're asking because we care. Nobody's asked before, Christopher said quietly. Nobody's cared enough to ask. Margaret sat down on one of the salvaged chairs, making herself less intimidating. We're asking now. If you want to tell us, we'll listen. And if you don't, that's okay too. Christopher was silent for so long that Thomas thought he wouldn't answer. But then, slowly, words started coming. My parents weren't bad people. They just had problems. Big problems. He took a deep breath. My dad lost his job when I was 9. Construction work, economy crash. He couldn't find another one. Mom worked 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough. We lost our apartment. Daniel's hand found Christopher's, squeezing tight. We lived in our car for a while. Then we stayed in shelters. My parents tried, really tried, to keep things normal. But Dad started drinking. Mom was always exhausted. They fought all the time about money, about Dad not finding work, about everything. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. This story was different from his and Margaret's, but the fighting, the child caught in the middle, that was the same. One night, they had a really bad fight. Dad left, just walked out of the shelter and didn't come back. Mom looked for him for weeks. She stopped going to work, stopped sleeping, just searched everywhere. Christopher's voice was completely flat now, emotionless, like he was describing something that happened to someone else. Social services came. Said Mom wasn't fit to care for me anymore. They were going to put me in foster care. Mom told me to run. She said the system would eat me alive, that I'd be better off on my own until she got back on her feet. She said she'd come find me when she was better. Did she? Margaret whispered. Christopher shook his head. I waited for 6 months. Stayed near the last place I'd seen her. Then I heard from someone at the shelter that she'd been hospitalized. Mental breakdown. They didn't know which hospital, and I couldn't ask without social services finding me. So you've been alone since then, Thomas said. For 2 years. Yes. I learned how to survive, how to find food, shelter, how to avoid police and social workers, how to be invisible. Christopher finally looked up, meeting their eyes. And then Daniel found me. Or I found him. 3 months ago, I saw this kid sleeping in an alley, crying. I recognized him from the missing posters. I knew I should tell someone, but he begged me not to. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. I told Christopher about you and Mom, about the fighting, the custody battle, how I felt like I was being torn apart, and he said I could stay with him until things got better. I thought it would be temporary, Christopher admitted. I thought his parents would figure things out and he'd go home. But then weeks passed, then months, and Daniel said he couldn't go back. So I kept him safe, because I remembered what it felt like to be that scared and alone. Margaret was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Christopher, you're a child. You shouldn't have to be taking care of another child. You should be in school, living with a family, having a childhood. I had a childhood, Christopher said with quiet dignity. It ended when I was 11. That's just how things are sometimes. No, Thomas said firmly. That's not how things should be. And we're going to fix this. Christopher's expression became guarded. I don't need fixing. I'm fine. You're not fine, Margaret said gently. You're surviving. There's a difference. You've created something remarkable here, and you've kept Daniel safe, and that's extraordinary. But you deserve more than just survival. I don't want foster care, Christopher said, panic creeping into his voice for the first time. I won't go into the system. I'll disappear first. What if you didn't have to? Thomas heard himself say. What if there was another option? Margaret looked at him sharply. Thomas, what are you suggesting? Thomas looked at Christopher, at this child who'd been forced to become an adult too soon, who'd chosen kindness despite his own suffering, who'd become more of a parent to Daniel than Thomas had been. I'm suggesting that we don't let you disappear, that we don't let the system swallow you, that we figure out a way for you to have what you've given Daniel, a real home with real family. I can't live with either of you, Christopher said flatly. I'm not your responsibility. You became our responsibility the moment you kept our son safe, Margaret said. Christopher, we're not offering this out of pity or guilt. We're offering it because you deserve it, because you've shown more maturity and wisdom than most adults we know, because Daniel loves you, and that makes you family. Christopher looked at Daniel, who nodded enthusiastically. Please, Christopher, if they're serious about changing, we could all live together, like a real family. You wouldn't have to survive anymore. You could actually live. I don't know how to do that, Christopher whispered. I don't know how to be part of a family anymore. Neither do we, Thomas admitted. We're all going to have to learn together. We're all broken in different ways. But maybe that's okay. Maybe broken people can help each other heal. The silence stretched. Christopher's face was a battlefield of emotions, hope warring with fear, desire fighting with self-protection. I need time, Christopher finally said. I need to think about it. Take all the time you need, Margaret said. But while you're thinking, know this. Whether you decide to join our family or not, we're going to make sure you're taken care of. You'll have food, clothing, everything you need. And when you're ready, if you're ready, there's a place for you with us. With us, Thomas echoed, reaching for Margaret's hand. She took it, and they stood together, united for the first time in years. Daniel was staring at them with wonder. You're really not fighting. We're really not fighting, Margaret confirmed, because Christopher taught us something important. He showed us that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates or custody agreements. It's about showing up for the people who need you, and we failed at that. But we're going to do better. Starting now, Thomas added. Daniel, we're not forcing you to come home today, but we want you to know that when you're ready, there will be a home waiting. A real home, where both of us are present and working together. Where you don't have to choose sides or feel like you're betraying one of us by loving the other. And Christopher has a place in that home too, Margaret said. If he wants it. We have space. We have resources. And most importantly, we have love. Enough for both of you. Christopher looked overwhelmed, his usual calm facade cracking. Nobody's ever offered me something like this before. Then it's about time someone did, Margaret said simply. Daniel threw his arms around his mother, and she held him like she'd never let go. Thomas joined them, wrapping his arms around both, and for a moment they were a family again. Imperfect, broken, but together. Christopher stood apart, watching. Thomas extended a hand toward him. You too. Come here. Slowly, hesitantly, Christopher stepped into the embrace. And for the first time in 2 years, he let himself feel like he belonged somewhere, like he had a family. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in the doorway of what would be his new bedroom, Christopher beside him. It wasn't the old mansion or Margaret's apartment. It was something neither parent had owned before, a house they'd bought together, just for this purpose. A real home. It's big, Christopher said quietly, staring at the room that would be his. Thomas and Margaret had insisted on separate bedrooms for the boys, but they'd made sure the rooms connected through a shared bathroom. I've never had a room this big. Neither have I, Daniel admitted. Not one that felt like mine, anyway. The old rooms were just places to sleep between custody exchanges. Margaret appeared in the hallway carrying boxes. "Boys, come help with the rest of the supplies. Your father is trying to carry everything himself, and I'm worried he'll throw his back out." "I heard that." Thomas's voice came from downstairs, followed by a laugh. Christopher and Daniel exchanged glances and grinned. Hearing Daniel's parents joke with each other instead of screaming was still strange, but good strange, like discovering that winter could be warm. They'd spent the past 3 weeks in intensive family therapy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, no relation to the judge from the missing posters, had worked with them daily, sometimes together, sometimes separately. Thomas and Margaret had confronted decades of resentment. Daniel had finally expressed the pain he'd been carrying. Christopher had slowly, carefully, begun to trust that this wasn't temporary. The cottage behind the factory still existed. Christopher had insisted on keeping it just in case. "It's my backup plan," he'd explained. "If this doesn't work out, I need somewhere to go." Thomas had understood. Trust, once shattered, took time to rebuild. They carried boxes upstairs, clothes, books, supplies. Margaret had taken both boys shopping, letting them choose everything themselves. Christopher had been overwhelmed by the choices, repeatedly asking if things were too expensive. Margaret had gently reminded him that he deserved nice things, that wanting comfort wasn't selfish. "Dinner in an hour," Thomas called from the kitchen. He'd been learning to cook, real cooking, not just ordering takeout. Tonight was spaghetti, Daniel's favorite. Christopher stood by his window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. Children played in yards. A dog barked. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed. Normal sounds, safe sounds. "You okay?" Daniel asked, joining him. "Yeah, just processing. A month ago I was scraping by day to day. Now I'm living in a house with parents who actually want me here. It doesn't feel real." "It's real," Daniel said firmly. "They promised, and they're keeping their promises now." Downstairs, Margaret and Thomas worked side by side in the kitchen. They'd developed a system. She chopped vegetables, he handled the pasta. They moved around each other with practiced ease. "I talked to the school today," Margaret said. "Both boys are enrolled. They start next week. The counselor knows their situations and will be watching out for them." "Christopher's worried about being behind," Thomas said. "I told him we'd get tutors if needed. He's smart, Margaret. Incredibly smart. He'll catch up fast. He reminds me of Daniel sometimes. That same intensity, that same wisdom beyond his years." Margaret paused. "Do you think he'll ever really feel like this is home?" "I think he'll try. That's all we can ask. We just have to prove that we mean it. That this isn't temporary or conditional. That he's not here because we pity him or feel guilty. He's here because he's family." Margaret smiled, reaching over to squeeze Thomas's hand. "Who would have thought? Us, parenting together. Actually succeeding at it. We're not succeeding yet. We're trying. There's a difference. But Christopher taught us something important. Trying is enough. Showing up is enough. Being present is enough." After dinner, they gathered in the living room. Thomas had suggested family meetings. Nothing formal, just time to talk, to check in, to make sure everyone felt heard. "So," Thomas began, "first official family meeting. How's everyone feeling?" Daniel spoke first. "Good. Scared sometimes. But good scared, like things might actually be okay." "I feel the same," Margaret admitted. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for us to fall back into old patterns, but we haven't. We're doing better." All eyes turned to Christopher. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but finally spoke. "I talked to someone at the shelter yesterday. They told me my mom is doing better. She's in a treatment facility, getting help. They said she asked about me." The room went silent. This was the first time Christopher had mentioned actively looking for his mother. "Do you want to see her?" Margaret asked gently. "Maybe. Eventually. Dr. Mitchell said I should take it slow. Make sure I'm stable first before I deal with that." Christopher looked at his hands. "Is that selfish? She's my mom. Shouldn't I want to see her right away?" "It's not selfish," Thomas said firmly. "It's self-preservation. You've been taking care of yourself for 2 years. You deserve to be in a good place before you tackle something that difficult. And whatever you decide," Margaret added, "we'll support you. If you want to reconnect with your mom, we'll help. If you need more time, that's fine too. You get to control this. You get to choose." Christopher's eyes filled with tears. something that rarely happened. Thank you. For everything. For not giving up on Daniel. For not giving up on me. We should be thanking you, Thomas said. You saved our family. If you hadn't kept Daniel safe, if you hadn't shown us what real parenting looked like, we'd still be destroying each other. You taught us what matters. What happens now? Daniel asked. Do we just live here? Like a normal family? There's no such thing as normal, Margaret said with a smile. But yes, we live here. We go to school and work. We eat dinner together. We argue sometimes, but we work through it. We support each other. We're a family, an unconventional, pieced-together, imperfect family, but a family nonetheless. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch. The autumn air was cool, promising winter soon. Do you think we can do this? Margaret asked. Really do this? Two traumatized kids, two divorced parents trying to co-parent, living under one roof. Honestly, I don't know, but I know we're going to try. And I know that a month ago I couldn't have imagined sitting here with you without fighting. Now look at us. We're talking, planning, actually working together. If we can do that, we can do anything. Christopher changed everything, Margaret said. A 13-year-old street kid showed two successful adults how to be decent human beings, how to see past our own egos and actually care about someone else. He showed us that family isn't about perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Upstairs in their connecting rooms, Daniel and Christopher talked through the bathroom door. You think this will last? Christopher asked. Yeah, Daniel said with certainty. Because they're trying, really trying, and we're all trying together. That's what makes it work. I've never had a brother before, Christopher said quietly. You do now, Daniel replied. Forever, no matter what happens. You're my brother now. Christopher smiled in the darkness. A real smile, full of hope and possibility. 6 months later, the missing poster of Daniel Bradford was still visible on some telephone poles around the city, weathered and faded. But Daniel wasn't missing anymore. He was home, and so was Christopher. They'd learned to be a family, messy, imperfect, but real. Thomas and Margaret never remarried, but they became true partners in parenting. Christopher gradually reconnected with his mother, supervised visits that eventually led to a relationship healing slowly but surely. The cottage behind the factory became a symbol. Christopher still visited sometimes, remembering where he'd come from, never forgetting the strength it took to survive. But he didn't need it anymore. He had a home. He had a family. He had people who showed up for him every single day. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Thomas would look at the photograph that had started everything, him and Daniel on that beach, both smiling, and realized they'd found their way back to that moment of happiness. But this time, there were 4 people in the picture instead of 2, and this time, it would last.
That boy lives in my house, sir, the maid said quietly, but her words hit the millionaire harder than any shout could. Moment earlier, he had stared at the missing person poster in his hands, shaken by the face on it. A boy whose disappearance had triggered a nationwide search and a scandal threatening to destroy several powerful families. He never imagined a child could be connected to him in any way. But when the maid spoke, the world around him seemed to tilt. Images of the boy in his home, laughing, running through the halls, calling out to the staff, flashed through his mind, and the truth slammed into him. The child he'd been unknowingly sheltering was the very same boy whose story had shaken the country. As he lifted his eyes from the poster, the weight of that realization crushed him. The scandal was no longer distant. It was living under his own roof.